And let me ask our next panel to join. And as you do come up, let me just share a couple of opening thoughts, because our previous panel really, I thought, gave us a great flavor of the balance of privacy and competition. But I want to share one perspective that I think gets lost when we talk about data as currency and many of the sophisticated things that we're going to talk about today about AI and how data can be used. My first job working for DoubleClick, our CEO explained to me that our value proposition was that you had big companies, Lycos, Alta Vista, there's a few people here who remember, AOL, and they were getting all the advertising because Coca-Cola didn't want to deal with 10,000 different small websites. None of them had a big enough audience, and it wasn't practical. We would link them all up, and we would sell them as a very big package. We'd bundle them up as a very big audience, and then we would go on behalf of the DoubleClick network of 10,000 sites and go into Coca-Cola and say, hey, you can buy on our network just like on those big guys. And it was democratizing, and it brought these little players into competing and being into the network instead of being bought by the big players because they could get a share of ad revenue. Of course, it was a shock to them when somebody said, you're bad guys. You are tracking people across sites and you're enabling the sharing of data. I said, what are you talking about? The big guys have that data. I'm enabling all of this and bringing these small sites into the ad market. And so I think it's important to realize that the audience needs to be large for advertisers to spend their time, whether it's one site or large sites. And we could probably make all the data go away, in which case only the companies, whether they were platforms or some service that actually had a very big audience, that's where advertisers would spend their money. So in some sense, what the data allows is that lots of little players can actually end up being in this market. But it's hard to think about it if we have the tail wagging the dog, that it's all about the data. It is, when it comes to advertising, it's all about having an audience that is significant. So anyway, an important part of the question. But now we are going to talk about how it is, in many cases, in very significant ways, about the data. So we're going to talk about AI, open data. We're going to talk about some of the challenges of AI, the challenges of companies that want to do machine learning, that want to work with government data to support government services, to do machine learning. So before we get into some of the issues around making the data open and sharing it, Julie set up for us sort of a bit of a framework that maybe we should touch on first. Do we actually yet understand the OECD principles? The European Commission just put out the next phase of their principles. Microsoft has principles, Intel has principles, everyone has principles about being responsible for AI. Do we actually understand what that means when it comes to a service, when it comes to a particular product, facial recognition, advertising, any of the new services that's being proposed? Are these principles still very high level? Do good, don't do harm. We all agree. But what does that mean when it comes to a service or a tool? Okay, well, let me quickly tell you who I have here. I think we should have it on the next slide. Yes? In a minute, I'll tell you who we have here. Hopefully you already recognize Commissioner Dixon, who I'm delighted will participate in this discussion. We have with us Eli Calderon, who's the head of enforcement at the Israel Privacy Protection Authority. Shahar Bracha, the Director of Strategy and Planning Division at the Israeli government's ICT Authority. David Hoffman, the Associate General Counsel and the Global Privacy Officer of the Intel Corporation. And then, of course, our friend Orly Friedman Martin, the Head of Legal and Corporate Affairs for Microsoft Israel. And there you have them up there. Okay, so Helen, let me turn to you. You made a very clear point in your remarks that the legislators should be setting policy. Do privacy regulators, do data protection commissioners, when it comes to AI, have the framework to based on GDPR, I guess, to say this use of machine learning is ethical. Let's assume it's complying with the basics of GDPR. It's explainable. It's got the right abilities to do deletion or access. But do DPAs have the framework today to give guidance or to bring enforcement against different uses of AI that may or may not be acceptable?
Testing.
Got it.
Yes, you made a huge big assumption there that the application is already compliant with the basics of the GDPR, and I'd say we can later on talk a lot about how the basics of GDPR around artificial intelligence applications are complex enough to comply with. But your questions about the different high-level principles that apply that have been published by different entities and bodies, they're of course, as you said, very high level, and whether we understand or not exactly how they apply is going to be context dependent. And I think that's one of the challenges we have at this point. There's still a lot of discussion about what's coming, and while we know that deployment of artificial intelligence is every day now in lots of contexts, in search engines, in fraud detection and so on, it's not necessarily the type of artificial intelligence applications yet that have very significant legal effects on individuals, etc. So I think what we need to do, and what as regulators we're always keen to do, is engage directly with industry about very specific use cases, talk to them about how they've implemented the accountability requirements, the risk assessments, in particular the data protection impact assessments that they've undoubtedly conducted when they complied automatically with the basics of the GDPR, and then work through and sift out the much more difficult questions within it that border onto the ethical uses of the data. So I think we do have the capability, I think we will have, but we need industry to come forward and work with us as we work through specific use cases.
And Ellie, what about the privacy authority in Israel? There are tech startups everywhere that are AI tech startups. Should they be interested in your enforcement thoughts? Is this on your radar screen when you think about enforcement? Are any of these companies, doing something that is at risk? Is there a official policy of, high priority problems for AI, or is this still in the future for the authority?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, Limor, Jules. I think that I will start with giving you a different approach from the Microsoft optimistic view that we've seen, and just remember that when we talk about AI, not in the narrow AI that we currently use, all of us in our phones, AI is very unique because it's a race. It's a race that the winner will probably take it all. They say that probably the first AI to win the race would be the only one, or the last one. And we have to remember that this race might mean that the developers might disregard that basic security mechanisms and things that we would want them to install in their process. And privacy is just one of the risks. Of course, AI is only as smart as the relevant data it gobbles. So definitely privacy principles like minimization of data is something that, take it all now and we'll decide later what to do with it. Purpose limitation of the data, sometimes we take data that was accumulated long ago and the purpose was different, even from statistical analysis or de-identification, which is also a usage. Transparency and discrimination. How do you tackle an algorithm bias if you don't understand what it does or how it came to that conclusion? And we've seen examples like the Amazon facial recognition examples, etc. Free will, we talked about it in the last panel. Unfair influence, we see deepfake. We've seen the Facebook Cambridge Analytica case. And of course, security, which has a lot of cyber attacks, new kind of cyber attacks trying to bias the data or the models. So definitely there is a lot of issues that privacy and AI are in synchronization, and we don't have a clear view like everyone else where AI is going to. But it's not just privacy. It's, of course, also open competition for a big client that has a lot of data and what they do with it. It's the elimination of the ethical ability to make a decision where the professional that did it now is now taking this, sharing this capability with these engineers that are developing it, and the legal infrastructure, which from our point of view of privacy sometimes blurs the difference between personal data and non-personal data when you're taking the identified information but reusing it so that it's in the end very relevant to you. So it's not a clear view, and definitely there's a lot of talk in the government in regard to it. There are some mechanisms that we're working on it. For example, talking about regulatory sandboxes to help companies that are developing AI on using it in a secure environment. This talking about open data and the resolution, the government resolution of 1933 here in Israel to allow even smaller companies to change the game in which big companies have a lot of data, to allow that data also to the smaller players. So there's a lot of things that we do, and definitely if we're gonna, from my point of view, enforce the privacy law and other laws as well on AI companies, we will definitely need to look things also in a broader view. Hope that helped.
Shahar, I think that was a little pessimistic of you, perhaps sitting from the privacy chair about the risks of AI. What's the take at the ICT authority, and what the right policies and structures around AI means? As pessimistic, a little more optimistic?
A little more, but I'm with Eli on that one. AI in terms of government is two main vectors. The one, what are we doing with information in regards to AI, ML issues, ML studies from within the government, and you talked about earlier about the explainability issues and the bias issues surrounding that. And it's from within the governments, it's a really green field. I mean, there are a lot of startup companies and a lot of commercial companies doing work surrounding ML and AI for their own needs, and the responsibility that is required from them is much, much different when you're talking about data-driven policy and regulations. On the other hand, if regarding the open data initiative that Israel had, we are mandated to transform all the government information, that we are custodians of the public information. It's not ours, it's not the government information. So we want to put out all of the information for the public so they can re-examine the government work, and they can utilize it for their own businesses and start up new businesses. But at the other end, we have a different mandate to keep all of the information private and not to make information identifiable. So we are currently struggling with our two obligations. How do we transform and we publish all of the government information, even if we anonymize it? Publishing many anonymized databases make it obsolete. You can re-identify the information. All of us are probably aware of the Netflix example. We can re-identify from many different databases. Or if you are really heavily anonymizing the information, it's not more relevant. You cannot use it anymore. So it is really a greenfield in terms of the government, and there are not clear standards. It's just starting there, and we are doing all sorts of small trials to understand, not on private area, to understand what are the standards that need to be built there. So as I started, it's currently pessimistic, but looking forward, it's a more optimistic way.
I'll mention, just for your note, and maybe for others in the audience who are interested, we finished recently a project for the city of Seattle that other cities are using well, that tries to walk a city through how Seattle has a very strong open data law as well. Everything's got to be open unless privacy. But how does a city assess multiple releases over time So we helped build a little bit of a framework looking at some of the best practices, and I think a number of cities have found that useful. So David, cheer us up, perhaps. Intel is not a direct to...
Does that?
I'm anticipating that as a company with a major focus on AI, you can both share a bit more of the optimism that we're going to get more privacy, not less, or that there isn't a clash between the fair information type principles that Ellie mentioned and being able to do effective machine learning. But let's also take note that you're not, and maybe the reason why we have you on this open data panel as opposed to one of the earlier panels is you're not typically a direct to consumer company, and so you are dependent on maybe an open data set from the government to build a tool that might support a new service. Or Mobileye, obviously, as an example of an entity that's got to use government maps, has to do mapping itself by tracking information, or self-driving cars, which will have to know who's in the car, and a lot of safety information. So give us your seat. Does a large company that is both interested in getting data to train models and provide these services have a framework for how this can be done in a legal, ethical, and optimistic way?
I will say I'm incredibly optimistic on that front. And so it was a little bit of an explanation. For the past, about a year and a half ago, the company actually asked me to take on additional responsibility, which was not just work on some of the security and... You hear me? Is that better? Excellent. So about a year and a half ago, the company asked me to take on some additional responsibilities to oversee all of our artificial intelligence public policy, along with privacy and other data security and data policy aspects that I've been doing. And we took a look at what are the benefits that it looks like are going to be derived, and what are the concerns. And one of the things, and Orly and I and Jules and some others were talking about this yesterday, one of the things we looked at with AI is that it's difficult to talk about AI just in general, because AI is a computing functionality that really plays out very differently depending upon the individual sector that you're implementing. I mean, there's some overall issues around bias and fairness, but I think you really need to get down into the specifics. So my team spent a lot of time taking a look at these issues. Ricardo Basucci, who's here in the audience, and I co-wrote a white paper on AI and privacy and tried to call out some of the things that, as we're looking at individual sector implementations of AI, how can we do this by applying our the global common language of privacy that we have, that have come from the OECD principles over time. And we came up, we think we really can, but I think it does call into question in certain implementations some of the ways that we've used those principles over time. But you have to, I think, start digging really into the details to get there. I mean, Intel's history is one of creating open technology platforms that other people can build upon. So, to Jules, your mention of us needing access to data, yeah, we could. It's good for us to have access to data to develop technology, but we actually really want broad access for all sorts of innovators to be able to build and use our platforms that are optimized for different AI solutions. So, the example I'll provide would be if you look in the healthcare area, and let's just take an example. I actually, through my academic appointment at Duke University, was an advisor on a project to be able to use oncology clinician data in different ways, using certain AI applications to improve cancer care in the United States. So they were actually willing to go down a model of saying, look, we can get consent for the use of this for these purposes, although even under HIPAA we might not need to if we're just talking about optimizing the provision of care instead of some other purposes. But one thing that they couldn't figure out how exactly that they would do is, okay, if we got consent and we train the algorithm to improve the care, and then somebody comes back to us and said we want to revoke consent, what do we do with that, with the algorithm that we already trained? And even if we figured out a way to do that, if a regulator came back to us now and said, okay, for the algorithm that you trained, can you go back and explain why it's getting the results you just had? And you had to delete data out of the original data set? We're not exactly sure how you would actually even try to manage that. So these conflicts between some of the implementations of some of our long-term policy principles get to be very difficult. I think we need to do what, Jules, what you and your organization have been doing, which is digging into the individual use cases and describing how we can still achieve the ends of innovative data use, getting the social benefits while preserving privacy, but might have to be done in a little bit different way than we've done in the past.
Orly, let me ask you this. Julie talked about the global framework and Microsoft's thinking. One of the phenomenons that we've had in Israel sometimes is that we've had leading companies doing the leading edge activity around the world in fintech, in other areas, while some of the local government agencies or local banking industry was sort of a generation behind. That the government policy or the government agencies or local businesses were not the early adopters, which is shocking to people outside because they say, well, no, Israel, technology, startups, tech. And you say, well, let me tell you about going to the bank, right? We're seeing, are we going to see the same thing with machine learning? We have, again, all the startups leading the edge of new work in this area. Government is starting to think hard, but has the concerns that we heard expressed. Is Israel going to be in a position to be not just a technology generator for the world, but a policy generator? We've got brilliant people in this room and thoughtful academics and smart people in government. Is Israel going to be, in the area of AI, able to shape policies that go along with the technological prowess? Is that possible?
Well, I'll say I'm optimistic. It's a good point to be in. So I think you're right on spot. I think that it's something that is defining Israel to a certain extent, the perception of Israel being a startup nation and a very leading one, as Julie stated, number 3 in the innovation of technology coming out of it, whereas we see that the mainstream industries are not following as fast. And some of it is related, as you mentioned, to leaning on or standing behind some regulations that either are unclear, not certain, or not enabling in a way that is driving that innovation in the mainstream at the same level. I think, though, that regulators in Israel have been moving forward in the last few years. You could definitely see it in the banking sphere, for example. I think that's a good example of how regulation has moved forward and has enabled innovation to come forward into spheres that have been heavily regulated throughout the years, with taking into consideration the potential growth or the potential impact that that innovation could have on that industry. I feel, though, that there's work to be done that relates exactly to what Julie said at her ending, kind of poets, developers, poets. It goes to capacity building that goes across the board. So I think developers need to get ethics and humanitarians in their skills ups, so they take these considerations in while they develop the technology, whereas regulators or anyone else dealing from the policy side has to have the deep understanding of the potential of the technology, of really driving those impactful benefits for social advancements in areas that are really asking for it, whether it's education or healthcare or anything else, environment or what have you. I'm optimistic just due to the fact that I think Israel has proven that if we take this on a national level as a go-do, we can do that. I think we did it in the cyber field. And today I think there is an initiative on a national level to drive that national plan for AI and to take all those pillars that include government and industry, ethics and potential startups that could drive in, education and capacity building across the board, and to make it in a very holistic plan that would actually drive Israel in all its levels, including its mainstream, to that next level of being very relevant in AI.
I understand that some government agencies in Israel are starting to look at, how to provide services more efficiently by using, data more effectively. I want to maybe raise whether there are any policies or oversight in place today that helps guide that. But let me ask Helen first. As Ireland goes, obviously also a home to many leading tech companies, what's the state of machine learning or your sort of awareness or guidance to the government agencies that are looking to use data that are regulated by the Irish data protection law? Are they lagging industry? Are they, what's the state of the government use for social services, the government use for prison reform? We've obviously seen around the world, in the US, both good examples and bad examples where agencies are using data and critics are pointing to discrimination or bias or problems, but then also lots of agencies that are showing that they're filling potholes quicker, that they're doing more efficiently identifying what buildings are likely to have fires. So instead of inspecting fires just randomly, neighborhood by neighborhood, they actually do some machine learning and they say, send the inspectors to the areas that are likely to have fires and do the building inspections there so that we can actually solve the goal instead of just do the inspections. What's the state in Ireland? Do you have some take on that?
Yeah, sure. So fortunately, I would say government is entirely behind the type of indigenous and multinational industry that we have in Ireland, not just in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning, but generally in technological terms. And the reason I say fortunately they're lagging behind is because they're also lagging behind in terms of responsible data protection implementation. Ireland, for the first time a couple of years ago, appointed a chief information officer at government level to produce a data strategy, very similar role to Shahar, who I met the other day, implements for Ireland the PSI, the Open Data Directive from the EU. That this one's circulating again.
With a machine learning system, it would automatically lead us to the right mic.
Okay, this one has no light, but it obviously works. So, yeah, I was saying Ireland is very much at a government level, unfortunately, lagging behind in terms of accountable data protection. And so I would have a fear in terms of moving on to more advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence applications. They're, of course, looking at pilots in this area, pilots around blockchain applications as well, but they're not significantly advanced. So I mentioned that a couple of years back, Ireland appointed its first chief information officer, a similar role to Shahar, implements the PSI, the Public Sector Reuse Directive, in Ireland, and that department has published an open data strategy and a government data strategy. And again, it shows a complete immaturity in terms of understanding that the PSI directive is implemented without prejudice to data protection law. And the CIO spends a lot of time lecturing me about the great and innovative uses that can be made of personal data without willing to be accountable. So I think government in Ireland has huge leap forwards to make in terms, first of all, of getting the basics of GDPR correct in various government departments. I talked to some of you this week about a national identity card that's been introduced in Ireland. It's called the Public Services Card. And it's been introduced in Ireland without any specific underpinning legislation. 12 pieces of ancient social welfare primary legislation with 71 statutory instruments hanging off them tie together to produce the legal basis for this public services card. And the government says, don't worry about it, it's not mandatory, but it will be necessary to access any service in Ireland. And it has a requirement for a high quality photograph on the face of the card that has to be taken on site at the digital agency, and then a centralised biometric template database is stored. So that's really the situation in Ireland, happily moving forward technologically slightly slower, and an awful lot of ground to catch up in data protection terms.
And from the local government Israel side, what's your sense as to where machine learning projects are starting to happen in any significant way? We need a... I'll use this one. Let's share this one.
Well, I would say that the government is not, of course, is not developing AI, but is definitely considering using AI systems. We're definitely also looking at startups and technologies that are very innovative in that term. For example, I think I said it to some of you, AI engines that are analyzing AI models to have another layer of explainability on that. And definitely on the healthcare open data issues that we want to de-identify the information, utilizing AI mechanisms to create sorry? Synthetic data. Static data all the time. So we're definitely using it. We're learning about it. We're promoting our expertise and knowledge of this technology. I don't think that we have the capabilities to develop AI mechanism, but as users, we definitely want, and as regulators, we definitely want to know much more about it.
One thing that we probably should make clear, right, is that the actual development of AI seems to be very quickly and broadly shared globally. All the leading AI researchers are academics of high caliber. They publish. Even the ones that are at companies insist that they want to continue publishing. So the knowledge is no secret, and doesn't seem to be a secret really at any of the biggest companies. And in fact, the tools seem to be increasingly put out, open source, in the cloud. Privacy tools are being added in as well in the cloud. And so the kind of the core techniques and technology, what ends up being necessary, maybe David, you might jump in here, is what does my organization want to do? And do I actually have the data that I need to do it in a way that can train my model, and also enough data that I don't do it in a biased way so that I'm able to test and assess my model. Is that a fair? Sometimes it feels like the conversation about AI makes it sound like, the leading companies are the ones who are going to dominate AI, and for the way it seems to have developed is everything that you might think was top secret IP is immediately being published in journals and at conferences. It just seems to be the culture of the scientists in this space, and increasingly even sort of pushed out. But then the challenge is, are you able to do something useful with it, because your data set to do what you need to do to serve your citizens, your people, your customers, needs to be robust enough. It's why I argued sort of the privacy as a market competition ends up having a challenge if my goal is to serve my customers the best way, in a way that uses data wisely. What's your reaction?
I would say I think we're going to see a dynamic environment where organizations are going to want to create their own tools from the data that they have, but increasingly they're going to use vendors that have access to data elsewhere that will supplement that. The questions I think that are interesting right now, there is a lot of intellectual property that's being released, and Intel's been doing some interesting work. Actually, I think one of my colleagues is speaking either right now or just finished speaking about some of our homomorphic encryption tools for AI that we've been opening up and creating providing open source access to allow for better access to data while still protecting privacy. But what we still are needing in many situations are actually the implementation at a standards level to allow for access to the use of the data. So, and some of this is not completely new. The Obama administration in the United States had actually something called a Data Advisory Council, the DAC. It was part of an advisory committee of private sector industry representatives, academics, and think tank folks to our Department of Commerce. They came up with a bunch of recommendations, including one that I thought was actually a really good one, which was governments should invest in creating some APIs for the access to their government data that could then be standardized and people could use. And while doing so, should be figuring out how to provide privacy controls in the actual API for the access to the data. Unfortunately, that advisory committee then ended at the end of the Obama administration. The recommendations, I think, are still hanging out there, but you're starting to see in many countries around the world, as part of their AI strategies, obligations for individual government agencies to create AI strategies for that particular agency, which includes investment in research and development and investment in procurement, which is going to continue to fuel the creation of those access tools that you're describing. So I'm incredibly hopeful, and I think the more countries that can pursue using procurement and spending as a way to incentivize the creation of really what are dual-use AI technologies and services, that'll really propel us forward.
So the next phase of open data is making it available in a way that can support machine learning by startups and by companies alike in a responsible way. Orly, you looked like you were going to jump in there.
Just to add to that, because I echo what David has just said, but looking at Microsoft, we come with that understanding that AI needs to be democratized. So when we look at our platform, we make the platform, the tools and the services themselves accessible for different companies in order to use the AI capabilities on their data sets in various ways, and to have the ability to actually use the strength of either Intel or Microsoft or Google, the big ones that have already ran to build AI capabilities and to integrate it not only in our products, in our platforms, but actually in the services that we provide or enable others to use so they can actually fulfill or build on those capabilities. So I think moving forward, and this is not, obviously the AI sphere is not to be left for companies alone, and this is why I think these conversations, or the thing that we're trying to do through policymakers, joining industry, academia, and so on together. But I think that companies at the size of the hyperscales, the big companies and so on, the fact that we're opening that and enabling others to actually build on these capabilities, actually to implement with their applications in relatively easy, really, really easy steps. It could be 2 lines of a code, and then actually have those capabilities internally. That's exactly kind of opening that competition or that ability for each of them to fulfill the promise of AI. Exactly.
Israel is working on efforts to examine secondary uses of health data to support research. Machine learning on health data is already an area where some Israeli startups and medical researchers have shown that they can detect cancers more quickly and different kinds of really, earth-shattering, important, socially beneficial breakthroughs. Do we have the identification tools, whether it's health data or whether it's open data from the government or other ways that companies who might want to share data with researchers because they think they can support valuable research? Do we have the de-identification tools? There are some Israeli startups again. Differential privacy was born partly in Israel. Kobi Nissim with Cynthia Dwork at Microsoft Research. Kobi Nissim, one of the co-authors. Companies like Duality and Nanos and others that are doing very sophisticated de-identification. But it still seems like there's a shortage of tools, expertise. Do government agencies even have, experts who can assess whether or not a particular data set is at risk so that it can make it open, or can assess whether other data sets that are being shared, by companies that are being called anonymous, so, you know, safe to share, or the health data? Do we have the sort of expertise from the scientific industry connected enough to government and the law and policies that are even nuanced to capture this, to weigh the benefit and the risk? There could be no risk, then we'd have nothing, right? We somehow are going to say we'll have some risk that we can accept because the benefit is good enough. Who's going to be sitting with the engineer and assessing this? Is there an ethics committee? There's a lot in this, so I'll ask any of you who are jumping in. Shahar.
I'll jump in. Cloud and AI is coming more and more a commodity product. The hypercloud vendors are bringing it more and more. So the let's say not the AI scientists, particular professionals surrounding this area alone can work with it, but each and every developer can jump into this field, and we can see more and more raising numbers of developers in the AI field. So in terms of tools, we are set. In terms of what you mentioned, the de-identification and anonymization issues, there are some tools, and we see more and more tools. It's a greenfield, especially for governments. But we are building now a framework of stating, a matrix that's stating for each data field that you require, or each data privacy measures that you required, what sort of de-identification solution do you need? Because de-identification is not one solution. What is not a one-size-fits-all. It's based on what you are planning to do with information, how private is the information, how plausible is it that you will be able to re-identify the current information. So currently, we are summarizing an AI strategy for the government of Israel, moving forward as we did a few years ago with cybersecurity and with the healthcare. We are starting to work with our partners from within the government, creating a data strategy, because without data, all of the AI will be as simple as Microsoft Office. We won't be able to use it because the data simply is not there. So data is the new oil. Everybody knows it. The big tech companies understand it. But within the government, we're just starting to standardize it because all of the information is there. It's digitally there. It's all in computer system. But you have not a single record talking with each other. You have a lot of processes where you need to gather information, even if it's just for aggregative data sets that you want to do for data-driven regulations. So in terms of the standards and looking forward, this is more an optimistic look there, and we are seeing many ministries starting to examine ML work and AI work surrounding data that is not currently private, to understand what is unknown for us and what more sets and standards we require to publish. So the adoption within the ministries would be much more easier.
Am I right, though, that there's a dearth of available experts here? It's probably the one area where maybe once a month I'll get a call from a company, an agency. Who can we work with? Who can come in and look at, here's what we want to do. We don't want to be subject to GDPR, or we want to be sharing, data in this way. We need someone to advise us what level of detail in this data set is available. It does seem like there's a dearth of experts, and even if there are some statistical experts, they don't necessarily spend their days with the GDPR, so they know how to do de-identification, but they're not engineering poet lawyers who are able to tell me that this risk is legal as well. Is there anybody else? And Helen, how do you deal with this as well? If a company made a data set available or promised something was anonymous, how would you assess? Do you have a statistician, or would you look to sort of external experts? It feels like there's a gap here. Am I right?
Yeah, there could well be gaps, and we mightn't even know what gaps are there. I mean, at the moment, we certainly don't have a statistician on our staff. We've got technologists who you've met before from various backgrounds, like ad tech and infrastructure and so on. Precisely what we do would, of course, depend on what was reported to us and how we became aware of it. I was thinking when you were talking there, it reminded me of a lecture you gave in Trinity College Dublin earlier this year. I think you quoted a commentator that said, We don't question what the next thing we do with electricity is, and very soon we're not going to ask what's the next thing we do with data. It is all going to become automatic, and machine learning and AI are going to be indistinguishable from everything we do every day. I think we are going to get to that, but I think exactly as David and Shahar have said, we're going to have to work through very difficult examples where standards agencies, industry, data protection authorities, as Eli said, will be one of the smaller parts of it. So many different types of sectors, insurance, transport, are going to have to come together when these societal applications are going to become mainstream. So yeah, it's going to be very complicated. We don't do well when anything does require us to come out of our silos and create that multidisciplinary cooperation. But this type of future is going to make it unavoidable.
Let's try to squeeze in a quick Orly, and then we'll try to
Just
squeeze in
to
a quick
echo
question.
Ellen, or to add to that, I think it's even kind of it's a new age that actually requires all of us to come together in defining the new laws for this time, that actually brings all these perspectives in and actually takes that promise of AI on the one hand, but with the critical eyes that we all understand and the risks that are associated with that, and the right balance for it to stand. And in order for it to be really applicable or democratized and so on, and really to reach everyone or to be relevant for everyone, it would have to be based on the principles that I think are agreeable around this table, first of all. And second, it would have to be translated into practicality in specific scenarios. So,
Do we have a question or two from the floor for any of our panelists? Yes. Do we have a microphone or?
To hire a few robots, that's for sure, would cut out a lot of pain every day. Yeah, I think we're always going to be slower and behind because we're a public sector agency in terms of implementation, but there's absolutely no doubt in terms of triaging the thousands of complaints and breach notifications that we receive every day. AI type intelligence is going to assist us in the future. Actual implementation of it at this point is not concerning us from a technological point of view, because actually there's so much thinking from a human point of view that we still have to do in terms of understanding what is coming into us, what is the GDPR requiring us to do, and what do we want to do with it. So once we know the answers to that, maybe we can write code to automate it, which is really all artificial intelligence will do. But yeah, I think it could be of huge assistance to us in the future.
And in some places, this is actually already happening, although I don't know that much yet within government enforcement agencies. So there are a number of technical advocacy type groups that have built tools that, for instance, download all the apps from the app stores, but then simulate human, behavior to then see what the apps actually do, and then they try to capture and categorize. Hey, look, these apps are all disrespecting users' settings. These apps are all sending information. We're working with one of them, for instance, to try to help do some broader monitoring of apps, and it helps scale a big look. Maybe GPEN might cooperate one day, and I know some of the attorneys general in the U.S. have commissioned sort of the people who built these tools to do reports for them. So, they haven't hired them or built them, but they've, as a vendor said, hey, I read your report, but I need to do it. I'm the investigator. And so they've sort of commissioned, and delegated, and then, go ahead and go through it themselves to make decisions. Final thought, David.
Well, just want to add thing. I think it's a great point, actually. And I think it's a place where we need investment globally And Intel, we actually put out a proposal for a comprehensive U.S. privacy law. It's actually on the web. People can comment on it. It's at usprivacybill.intel.com. As part of that, we said that the U.S. Federal Trade Commission needed to drastically increase the number of people working on this in doing enforcement. We put a number of 500 in as a placeholder, and we think that might be too low for what is going to need. But we actually said we thought about half of those people should be technical resources to develop these kinds of tools and to act as advisors to the folks who are doing enforcement. I think it's the only way we're going to get scale longer term. And good, well done, strategic, robust, harmonized, predictable enforcement is good for everybody.
Join me, please, in thanking our panelists for their contributions.